Well, hello, this is Timothy Egan. I'm the author of Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher, which is the story of a very famous, long ago Seattleite, Edward Curtis, the photographer of American Indians.
Tim, this is where Princess Angeline lived as an old woman in the late 1800s on the tide flats before the city was built up. Tell us about her encounter with the young photographer and how she became the first American Indian that Curtis photographed.
Well, this was a moment where two of the worlds literally clashed. Seattle was then the fastest growing city on the West Coast. It was also on its way to becoming the biggest city in the world named for a Native American. At the same time, they passed a law making it illegal for an Indian to live within the city limits. But they had made one exception, and that was for the last surviving child of Chief Seattle. So she lived down here in the waterfront in this tiny little shack. It was just a little sort of sloped down toward the water. It was before it was all built up here. So she dug clams for a living and did people's laundry, and she went house to house, this princess as they called her. Well, Curtis comes down the hill from his studio, and he is a man in full at the time. He's a prosperous, young, good-looking portrait photographer who's taking pictures of all the Seattle debutantes and all the bankers and merchants, and he has a full calendar. He comes down the hill and he sees Angeline on the shore, and it's sort of an epiphany for him. He sees her against Puget Sound, against the Olympic Mountains, and he sees the sort of original part of the Northwest being erased, which is being erased. They're literally cutting down the hills at that time, shaving off all the forests, and they've moved all the native people. And he sees something that's sort of a transcendent moment, this sort of last authentic person of the original Seattle. And so therein starts a negotiation which lasts several days and eventually leads to his taking her picture. People often accuse Curtis of romanticizing his Native Americans. Well, not in this picture. This very first picture, he wanted this hard face. So there was this tiny woman dressed in multiple dresses, multiple shawls with the rocks in her pocket, no teeth, a single tooth, I take it back, deep lines in her face, a little, safety pin holding her shawl together, and just sort of this timeless picture looking away, sort of the woman who's seen so many ages pass, so many times. She came of age when this was paradise and there wasn't a single Anglo living here, and she's spending her last year here when they're completely erasing all traces of her people. That's what he wanted to convey in that portrait, and it becomes his first real picture of Indians. Well, we're standing on the corner, the southwest corner of 4th and University, which is where Ed Curtis had his last Seattle studio. Now, this was a very prominent tourist destination because Curtis by then was very well known. He was not just the best known portrait photographer on the West Coast. By then he'd made his reputation as this famous Indian photographer. Two things are interesting about this place. It's no longer here, of course, so you can't see anything that's Curtis, but there is something that will remind you of the great man who was here. Across the street here in the Cobb building, you have these Indian heads that look down from what looks like about the 12th floor, and the Indian heads are looking down on the Curtis studio. It is an homage to the great man and what he did with Native Americans. We're in the Flurry Gallery, which is just a few blocks from where Curtis had his first studio, and this is perhaps the premier photographic gallery in the world for all things Curtis.
So what are we looking at right now here on the wall, this beautiful young Indian woman?
This is fascinating because, first of all, it was taken in 1899 before Curtis embarked on the big project, the Magnificent Obsession, which started in 1900. Also, it shows he's exploring his region. He's moving outside. He's trying to find native people beyond Princess Angeline. He's told there are people all around. So this picture is called Lummi type. The Lummi, of course, live on the coast about an hour and a half north of Seattle. What's very revealing about this picture, and also very consistent with what Curtis did for the next 30 years, is the light on the face. You look into that face and you see so many dimensions. You don't just see a type. That's what was so profound about him. He broke barriers. He broke through walls. You see a human being in those eyes and in that face. His legacy is really two things. One is the artistic achievement, what he accomplished, what a man with a 6th grade education, basically a dropout from a single-room schoolhouse, pulled off. I looked at this thing and I'm just stunned at the scope of it. The 30 years, the 40,000 photographs he took, 80 tribes documenting their lives, their mysteries, their myths, their ways of life. That's one achievement. The second achievement is what he brought to Native people still today. And if you travel to the reservations as I did and talk to Native Americans now about Curtis, you hear time and again, I look into that picture and I can see my great-grandfather. I can see someone who is me. As someone told me, it's memory in blood. And that's what I think is so lasting, that, that's the people who led the Curtis revitalization were not necessarily art scholars. They were the subjects, the Native people themselves.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.